I woke before the false dawn to the metallic tang of irrigation lines and the distant groan of tithe carts. My palms raw from graft that never felt like enough. The sky was a bruise of weak light, the planet's thin sun hiding behind a low, endless cloud. Machines breathed in the fields like beasts, their pulse a slow rhythm under my feet, and the scent of damp earth and oil clung to my clothes. I cupped my hands and tasted salt and soil, the way people did when there were fewer words to explain hunger. The tithe ledger sat on the kitchen table where my wife had left it overnight, its brass corners dulled with damp. The ledger was a flat, cold thing stamped with a seal that did not care who had folded it open. Numbers marched across its pages in black ink columns with red ticks in the margins. Each red tick was a promise the planet had made to the administratum, and when that promise went unpaid, it became a shape that ate you slowly. Requisitioned harvests, conscripted labor, and legal erasure line by line. I ran a thumb over a scarred entry and tasted iron again, as if the ink itself could tell me whether this season would end with bread or with a summons. Outside, the irrigation lines sighed and clicked. Hydrostats pinged somewhere down the ridge. I listened for the sound the tithe carts made when they crossed the furrow road, an uneven clatter like old teeth, because their approach meant the ledger would become a ledger in action. Tithe clerks rode with them, pale-faced and precise, their wrist implants flashing with quota readouts. They did not come for malice, they came for law. The law had a meter for guilt, and mercy was not something it recognized. My son, who was small enough to still believe that seasons bent for him, snoozed with his cheek on the table under a rough hand-me-down shirt. His breath was even. My wife Mara had already left. She moved with the economy of habit, her boots sending a steady signal through the floorboards when she walked. She tended the brood sheds and the gene stockers, traded favors with the overseers. She had taught me how to read the ledger on nights when my hands shook too much to hold a plow steady. We had learned numbers together, learned how to place them where the clerks would not immediately pry. This season had been meaner than most. The southern fields, our rotation had taken blight early. Leaves browned at the edges and the corn tassels bowed like tired old men. I had patched rows under the haze of heat and fed them rationed water until my back tore. We had kept seed that should have gone to the communal reserves because Mara said the family table mattered, and because we had to keep something that would sprout. Keeping that seed was a kind of theft, petty and dull and intimate. Tithes required a percentage of the output. Keeping seed reduced the manifest. The ledger did not know love. It only knew numbers. There are ways to answer a shortfall. We could bend the ledger with forged entries, smudge numbers at night, and rely on the clerk's tired eyes. We could hide grain in the root cellars beneath the sheep stalls, a damp smell and a few extra sacks under straw. We could barter the children's extra hours at the Mechanists' Guild for a top-up of ration oil. Each choice carried a cost that rippled outward. Forging entries smelled like debt, hiding grain smelled like treason, bartering labor smelled like a slow erosion of the child's future. We counted costs the way other people counted days. At dawn, the tithe cart's groan came closer. Two massive wagons, steel plates dented, their harnesses stamped with departmental insignia, rolled over the causeway. Men in gray coats rode ahead, lists tucked into oilskin. The clerk for our sector was thin and younger than you would expect someone with that much power to be. He carried a device that stuck to the ledger and scanned it, a small earthing that hummed. He said nothing when I opened the door. His eyes were not unkind, they were simply practiced. "You're short," he said. His voice was the sound of a machine explaining its function. "I know," I admitted. Admitting was the first small, clean thing you could do. It made the universe honest for a moment. Blight took us early. He invoked the code book with an impersonal tilt of his chin. Shortfalls draw fines. Requisition follows repeated deficits. Labor tribunals if you cannot recompense. He tapped the ledger sharply. His fingers left a cold print. There are exemptions for seed loss and pest incursions. Evidence required. Evidence. The word landed like a stone. Where was the proof of blight? Where was the inspector who would stand with me in the mud and nod while the ledger took pity? Evidence required people with authority, and people with authority did not travel the furrow road without a sealed summons from above. When the magistrates came, they came in fleets. For everything small, the system was large and slow. For everything urgent, the system was blind. I presented what I could: clumps of spoiled cobs, a smear of fungal spores on a leaf, a list of losses patched together in my own hatchery handwriting. Mara had already marched the broodshed overseer to the gates to corroborate the blight he had nodded, then shrugged the shrug of a man who had learned to shrug. The clerk took the evidence, scanned it into his device, and then told me that he would recommend a reappraisal. It was the beginning of a process. It might take weeks. In those weeks, the ledger was not an idea. It was teeth. "You will receive a partial requisition today," he said. "We will leave what is necessary for immediate subsistence." Speaking the words, he adjusted the seals on the wagons and opened the first bins. Men with gaunt faces and calloused hands shouldered canvas sacks and measured out what the ledger demanded. The sound of grain being poured into rough sacks filled the air like rain. They left us a ration. It was enough to keep the boy from going hungry for a month if we rationed well and stretched a few of our own stores. It was not enough to save anything more. Watching them leave with more than they took had a particular sting. The clerk did not stay to see how the ration would be split in our home. He had already slid onto his cart, his device glowing faintly in the gloom, and the tithe men drove on toward the next row of farms. Like a gray tide, I closed the door and leaned my forehead against wood that had known both harvest and hunger. Mara's face was a map of lines I had not noticed until then. She had counted in different currency. How many weeks of feed before the sheep failed? How many clean sacks for seed? How much ration oil to keep the pump motors from seizing? She folded her hands and breathed through her nose in a way I know means planning and fear braided together. "We could take what's left behind the east root cellar," she said finally. Her voice was steady as the monorail thrumming in the distance. "We could bury 2 sacks under the straw and tell them they spilled during transit." I saw the ledger in my mind, rows of tidy numbers balanced against their own rules. I saw the tithe clerk's pale face reflected in the device, the faint smugness of someone who had not set a plow blade in dirt. I saw my son's small face in the morning light, his hands sticky with porridge. "If they find it," I said, "we'll be hit with more than fines. A recovery operation does not end at a failed manifest. They'll audit the year. They'll pull seed claims from our account. They'll list unpaid labor." My words were a list of consequences, and they landed heavy. Mara's hands tightened around a kettle. "Then what?" she asked. "We let the ledger dictate everything until there is nothing left to hide? We watch them take the last of our seed and call our children conscripted labor because we followed the numbers?" We both knew the ledger did not care. It was the law's instrument, and laws were designed to smooth out the chaos of planetary sustenance. But laws also made decisions easy for bureaucracy and impossible for people. The ledger's rulings were cold, but they were also constant. Life on an Agri-World lived between those rulings. I thought of the neighbor farm, the one up the ridge that had taken in 2 refugee families after the blight started. Old Joran had always been talkative at market, offering speculative remedies and half-true fortunes. He had money tucked away in a safe spot and a temper. He also grew the late-root wheat that did well in damp conditions. A bartering thought unspooled in my head. a sack of our seed for 2 sacks of his. The idea came with its own hazards. Joran loved to keep accounts in his head and was prone to speak loudly when he felt wronged. Bartering required trust or the spectacle of witnesses, and witnesses invited paperwork. I had one other option in mind, a dark, clean idea that sat in the back of my skull like a stone. The mechanists who serviced the irrigation pumps would take a bribe for parts. The parts would keep the pumps running. Longer, the pumps would give us a small yield. And that yield could be enough to show the ledger we had made our numbers. Bribes were not crimes without witnesses, and mechanists had secrets the size of reservoirs. But bribery eroded things in a different way. It meant you owed someone who could collect in pounds of flesh or favors. I looked at Mara and at the ledger between us. The boy shifted in his chair, waking to the light at the window. He rubbed his eyes and asked, in the blunt way children do, why the tithe men had taken so much. I had no answer that would not make him older than he was. My mouth was dry. Decisions are measured not by how you make them, but by what they will cost. When the first real light of dawn cleared the horizon, painting the furrows silver, I walked the southern row alone. The blight left a stain on the soil, a darkness that clung to boot soles. I ran my hand along a stalk, felt the powdery gove of rot, and considered each of my choices as if they were hands extended. Hide seed and risk legal erasure, bribe the mechanists, and place trust in men who evaluated people the way accountsmen evaluated ledgers, barter with Joran, and invite the eyes of neighbors into our private ration. Each choice pushed me forward in a different direction. None of them felt right. I turned back toward the homestead with dirt caked under my nails and the tithe ledger heavy with its brass corners. I reached for the ledger and felt the weight of the numbers like a thing that could bruise. Then I decided I would not let the clock of bureaucracy run its slow groove without answering. I would not forge now, that would be a knife for later. I would not let them find hidden sacks without a fight. I would go to the mechanist yard, talk in trade and in whispers, and try for parts. If that failed, I would walk to Joren's and offer the swap in the open light. If he refused, then I would stand at the furrow road when the next wagon came and speak truth to the clerk until he tasted it. The decision felt like stepping onto thin ice. The sky lightened and the tithe cart's wheels were faint on the far road, a distant rumor. I lifted the ledger, thumbed the cover, and set it into the saddlebag warmed by stove steam. I told Mara I would be back before the sun climbed, because promises mean something in the small economies we keep. She nodded, and the nod was a pact. I left the homestead with my coat pulled tight and a sack of seeds small enough to be convincing and large enough to be dangerous. And I walked toward the mechanist quarter, where favors were spoken of in low tones and agreements were sealed with oil. The pump motors hummed a note that matched the beat of my heart, and I realized I had already stepped into the ledger's margins. I intended to bend the rules, not break them yet, and to buy us the time we needed. The road ahead smelled of metal and hot earth. There was a choice to be made, and I kept it held like a hot coal in my palm. The ledger lay open on the bench, its pages like pale skin creased and freckled with soil. Dawn had a thin, filthy light then, the kind that made every nick in the wood a canyon. I traced a column with my thumb and felt the rough smear of ink. Not accounting ink, something older, like a farmer's prayer rubbed into paper. Outside, the lane was already a ribbon of work boots and low voices. Someone coughed twice, once for courtesy and once for the cold, and the sound rolled through the open door like a prelude. I closed the ledger so the page couldn't be read in the hallway and set my palm over it to warm the paper. They came in pairs mostly, a man who walked like he owned roads and the other who walked like he owned nothing. The first wore a coat with small brass teeth on the collar that glinted even in the weak light. He carried a cylindrical tin stamped with a number and the star mark of the district. His voice had the flat cadence of someone who had practiced goodwill until it sounded like law. The second had a notepad tucked into a leather wrap and scribbled with a stick of chalk. He smelled of combustion and paper glue like the inside of a ration pack. They introduced themselves as quietly as people could when they were there to take things. I led them to the ledger as if I were guiding them to a relic. The man with the brass teeth opened his tin and let a small officer of his administration look out. A tin-clipped servitor, wheels whining, a single glass optic. It blinked once and illuminated the ledger like a sun answering a prayer. The optic fed numbers to its master with the cheerful indifference of a machine that had never known hunger. The servitor counted with a voice that sounded like gravel in a tin throat, emitting a low, mechanical hum each time it registered a line on the page. The ledger's ink seemed to quiver under that light, as though the letters strained against their fate. They asked for the tithe. Every collector asked for the tithe as though the word were a cure or a curse depending on which end you held it. I named figures that morning the way I had named fields during other decades, by smell and by soil. I told them yield, loss, seed left for next spring. The man with brass teeth listened and nodded and rarely blinked. The chalk scriber wrote shorthand that was unreadable if you squinted, but the servitor's eye pulsed each time a number matched a ledger line. I could hear the breath of the house slow when the tally went above the threshold, as though the timbers themselves waited to see if we'd keep our bones. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes at the doorway and watched from behind the rungs of the stair like witnesses summoned to a market. They had learned to stand still while adults argued with law. My daughter's hand found my rough-stitched sleeve and squeezed. The pressure had in it a language older than contracts. I kept my face soft for her because every expression I allowed myself tonight would have to be carried for years. The collectors watched the hand in my sleeve and then looked back at the ledger as if pages could be judged guilty. The brass-toothed man smiled then, small and practiced. He called for the audit seal. The seal was a thin disc of stamped alloy that the collectors used like a verdict. They pressed it against a corner of the ledger and let 2 drops of crimson fluid bead and run into the furrows of the page. I did not flinch at the color. The Imperium had many hues, and this was simply official. The servitor keyed the code from the seal and cross-checked it against their tin. My account for seed reserves and surplus sheaves aligned in rows and columns until the ledger seemed to breathe in time with the servitor's hum. When the numbers balanced, the brass-toothed man's shoulders relaxed enough to look almost human. Balance did not mean mercy. It meant a new timetable. They read aloud a list of deductions that sounded like scripture. First, the base tithe, an obligatory share that took the first leaf and the last thought of what you had hoped to keep. Second, the transit levy, for the wagons to carry the grain into the fleet's channels. Third, a contingency hold that could be converted into grain assurance at the discretion of the district if weather broke or battalions requisitioned. Each deduction sounded like a small theft recited by a clerk who loved the shape of fractions. I listened and measured my breathing to it, listening for any scrap still mine, any number that left fingers uncorseted. They wanted my wage laborers' lists next. I named them with the awkward formality of an inventory. Old Jor, who bent like a sickle. Marta, who could mend a binder faster than the Binders Guild, and Simic, who'd come from the low fields because his farm had been seamed with plague last year. Speaking the names was a prayer and a ledger entry in the same breath. The collectors checked their own list against mine and nodded when a name matched and frowned when it did not. For Simic, who'd kept 2 sacks of seed back beneath the floorboards, they asked for proof of kinship and a birthmark. I did not produce proof. I let my silence answer like a folded map. The brass-toothed man's voice became softer when he asked about last season's losses. He spoke of blight in tones that made it sound as predictable as rain. I described the mildew's gray film on the underleaf, the way it breathed out steam when we burned it, the taste of bitter sap in the cowherd's mouth the morning after he raked the infected roots. They recorded the loss with a bureaucrat's mercy. They allowed us a margin for rot, a sliver to keep the seed for planting. In practice, that sliver had the weight of a promise. Keep the sliver and you might farm another year. Lose it, and the ledger would blink an unkind red and make arrangements that would move men from fields to the city wards. A small thing shifted the balance. The chalk scriber found a line he'd overlooked, a sum of grain destined for the temple stores in the next district. He tapped his stick against the page and frowned. The servitor's optic brightened. For a moment, everything in the room was a small constellation of worry. If that line had been processed earlier, our margin would have been enough. As it stood, the line needed to be adjusted. They suggested a remedial write-off that would come from our contingency hold. I felt the ledger like the body of an enormous, indifferent beast. If you cut a piece away, the rest bled on schedule. I made a choice then that tightened my chest. I signed the necessary endorsements with a roughened finger and a clumsy ink stamp. The brass-toothed man accepted the marks and the chalk scriber sealed the entries. The servitor rolled a spiky wheel and recorded the reconciliation. Outside, a wagon creaked, its harness clinking like the sound of a bell about to toll. The children shifted nearer to the doorway, waiting for the moment the collectors would leave our yard and take with them the fruits of all our worry. My daughter's eyes were small moons reflecting the servitor's optic. She believed in the fairness of numbers because she did not yet know how merciless math could be when wielded by others. When they packed to leave, the brass-toothed man paused and looked at me with an expression that was neither harsh nor kind. "Keep the seeds safe," he said quietly. "Tithes paid, but seasons harsh." The words had a shape that was an order and a benediction in the same syllable. He tapped his tin and the servitor's eye blinked like a slow single prayer. I did not respond with anything the man might have used in his ledger. Instead, I wrapped the leather cover of the ledger close and pressed my palm to it. The skin of my hand knew the weight of ink and the cost of silence. After they left, the lane seemed to shrink around us. The air held the scent of spent oil and hay. I opened the ledger again when the last wheel's echo had merged into the morning. My eye went to the contingency line. There it was, the small allowance that would let us seed in spring if the next months behaved. The number was a promise that lurched when I put my trust in it. I wrote a note in the margin in a different ink, a private mark no servitor would recognize. It was a list of things not recorded. The packet beneath the floorboards where Simic kept 2 sacks. The aunt who cached pulses in her dress, the knackered bag of beans behind the bakery. Small economies that kept us human when regulations reduced us to numbers. A draft came through the cracked window and lifted the page as if the ledger were breathing. I shoved the page flat and wrapped the ledger in cloth. The plan fed into my hands with a clarity that surprised me. It was simple and dangerous in equal measure. There was a cart behind the granary, old and liable to complaint, and a man who owed me a debt. If I could move just enough before the district reeled a second round of levies, perhaps Simic's sacks would birth seedlings again. Perhaps the contingency would hold, and the children would wake in spring to blades that cut grain instead of desperation. I checked the ink, and the ledger's lines seemed to stare back like a map I was only just learning to read. I set the ledger under a loose board and took a step toward the granary. The house exhaled behind me, closing its doors on the ledger and the tiny brave falseness of our margin. The lane smelled of wet straw and far fields, and the sky was a pale promise of warmth. My daughter reached for my hand, and I did not let go. We walked together toward the place where grain slept, where decisions could be made with fingers rather than contracts. My palms still carried the grit of midnight calculations. I moved forward knowing the road would ask for more than I could give if it wished. But I moved forward anyway because the ledger had closed and life did not wait for the page to be kind. The ledger lay heavy in my lap, its vellum whispering with every small shift. Dawnlight had not yet burned through the mist over the north furrows, but the lamps in the thresh house were already guttering down to embers. My thumb found the ink smear from when I'd signed yesterday, and the dark stain was a small private confession I couldn't afford to wipe away. The entry I stared at matched the official seal, the neat stamp of the Adeptus Administratum, and the numbers congealed into a single blunt fact. We were short. I had measured those numbers 100 different ways in my head while the rest of the farm still slept. Each calculation felt like pruning a life away. Subtract the rats, subtract the blight, subtract the seed you owed the field for next year. And the remainder was the portion the officials would carry off with smiles. The ledger had no mercy. Numbers were neat, impartial things. And they never cared that the winter had been cruel, or that my son's cough had lasted longer than prayer could chase it. Outside, a corvine call went up, one of the tithe runners making their rounds. The sound skittered across the yard and set the hens to nervous clucking. The runner's voice carried then, equal parts protocol and practice. Names, lots, batch numbers to the nearest handful, the way they listed your life like a crop manifest. A thud at the gate followed the iron ring of official business. I closed the ledger and set it beside the scales, feeling as though its weight had been transferred to my chest. When they opened the gate, they brought an official with the sun glinting off a badge of pale brass. She smelled faintly of the town's sweet tobacco and something sharper, oils and the iron scent that came with living among papers. Her fingers were stained with the same ink as mine. She didn't need to speak the words for me to hear them. Calculation, insufficiency, demand. Instead, she offered a small, practiced kindness. "We can arrange a schedule," she said. "Dividing is better than taking and leaving ruin." Her kindness was a hinge that could swing either way. Promises from an official were a kind of currency on Agrippina. Less useful than grain, perhaps, but more binding than a man's oath because they carried the weight of the mechanicum's foot and the ecclesiarchy's patience. I wanted to take the schedule, to sign whatever document she pressed into my palm that would spread the tithe over months. The ledger lay open again then, and the ink gleamed like a second horizon. To sign would mean that the harvest would be parceled into small deaths, one season at a time. To refuse would guarantee a single devastating seizure. My hands were quieter than my thoughts. They had spent a lifetime coaxing life from hard soil. Hands that knew how to judge a seed by feel rather than by line in a book. I thought of the root cellar where the stores were stacked in wooden bins, each crate labeled with wax and prayer. I had hidden 1 or 2 extra sacks beneath the oldest straw, a place the tithe runners seldom pried. The temptation to shift them now, to tuck them out of sight, flared and cooled like an ember. That choice would be a lie to the ledger, and lying to the ledger felt like lying to the empire. She watched me with a patience that was professional and precise, the kind you learned when your work could unmake men. "There are penalties," she said, softer this time. "You know what they are? We prefer not to enforce." Her eyes flicked to the cupboards where my family's plates hung. Plain wood, a chip on the rim where my wife had once dropped a spoon. It was like watching someone grading a harvest by the dents in a pot. Her pity was a tool. Her pity had clauses. I found myself bargaining in the same way I had once bartered seed for repairs, by offering what little I could spare. A crate of spiced grain for the clergy, 2 casks of oil, the antique sickle that my grandfather had sworn was blessed. Each offer felt like cutting a vine to save the bush. She shook her head to each one, not cruelly, but with the same economy with which the administratum trimmed ledgers. "Where you keep the rest matters," she said. "If found, penalties increase." The threat was precise and therefore terrible. When the exchange ended, she left me with a schedule and the ghost of a smile. The runner shut the gate behind them, the latch biting home with that inevitable finality a man feels when a door closes on hope. I listened to the residual clank of the harness, the distant creak of wagons, and something inside me went tight as a drum. The ledger sat like a patient thing, edges softened by years of being opened and closed. I opened it and read the schedule aloud, not for the paper, but to find air in the room with the words. The first payment would take nearly half our seed. The timeline stretched thin like worn twine. If I sent what they demanded, we'd plant less. Planting less meant thinning our future. It meant a year of hunger and perhaps 2. My son, if he grew, would have to learn to go hungry. The idea lodged like a thorn. I kept thinking of small faces around our table and the way the winter had left cough prints. The ledger did not have room for those faces, only for columns and dates. I checked the storeroom again, in a way I had no right to, counting sacks as if counting could summon more grain into being. There were cracks between the planks that the mice had chewed last spring. A draft slipped through them and blew the tiny hairs of straw loose like a promise unkept. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and stale ale, the house's own comfort against a world that preferred to make lists rather than forgive. A light on the horizon shifted, the sun moving, the day insisting forward, and I had to decide what shape my resistance would make. The village tanner, old Hader, had stopped by while the officials were still working the roads. He leaned on his stick and said little, but his fingers tapped a rhythm that read like counsel. "You can look for a buyer," he muttered, voice low so the ledger would not hear. Sometimes the off-world traders take what others won't risk. The thought of smugglers and traders made my skin crawl. We had lived our lives by law and custom. The thought of edging into shadow felt like stepping out of our skin. Yet the options the administratum offered were a slow death. The tanner's eyes were small and bright. He had watched harvests burn and still known which hides could be saved. I weighed the tanner's suggestion against the idea of going to the tithe hall itself, to stand before the clerk who had stamped my fate and speak plainly. Pride kept me from walking the paved steps to the hall, but necessity put one foot forward and then another. There was a rumor that petitions to the governor's aid sometimes, rarely bought leniency. I could stand in a line and tell my story. I could let my voice tremble until someone with the power to move numbers heard the human sound behind the digits. Or I could hide more grain, risking discovery and a penalty more public than any the administratum could write in ink. I found myself thinking of the old chapel beyond the East Ridge, where the priest kept a ledger of a different sort, names of the faithful, the sick, the ones who had died under silent roofs. The chapel smelled of wax and slow-burning incense, of hands that had held little ones and blessed them in the shadow of God machines far above. There was consolation there that had little to do with laws and plenty to do with promises. If I went, I could ask for a blessing that would steady my hand, or I could ask for charity. But charity in a world that measured everything was precarious and, like the tanner's roots, tainted by necessity. I made a list in my head and then crossed out half of it. The ledger's black numbers were a cage. Any motion that promised to take us out of it had a cost. The children slept on. That was mercy, and I could not awake them to the arithmetic of loss. I put the ledger back on the bench as if closing a wound. My palms were not steady, but they did not tremble enough for anyone to notice. There was a decision to be made before the sun climbed fully. stand to the hall and speak for our season, or find a shadow to hide grain until the next harvest. Each choice had teeth. I stepped outside and felt the wind hit my face, cold and honest. The furrows were a pale ribbon leading away from the homestead, and beyond them the far field still held the ghost of last night's frost. The oxen lowed somewhere in the distance, a sound that had nothing to do with ledgers and everything to do with the simple work of bearing weight. I ran a hand over the old hitch rail where my father had tied his plow. The wood was worn smooth by 100 years of hands. It felt like a promise that work returned each season and took its toll with a slow, inevitable fairness. I knew there would be no easy answer. No sermon would lift the arithmetic from the page. No charm or favor could change the way the administratum read a harvest. But I also knew waiting would not make the numbers grow. The tithe hall would not accept a refusal it would enforce in some form that left scars. If I wanted to keep something for the children, something to seed the next year, I had to move before the clerks finished their routes for the week. The decision felt less like choice and more like a pivot, one I was already mid-turn on. I took the ledger under my arm, its weight a steadying presence. I wrapped my coat tighter. The morning had teeth. My son would be awake soon, small feet padding the floor. I could wake him and tell him we were going to the hall to plead, or I could send him to fetch a neighbor who owed me a favor. Either way, my steps were already deciding for me. The path toward the tithe hall led through the market and past the governor's statue, its metal face worn by weather and repetition. I set my jaw and began to move, each footfall measured, carrying the ledger, the measure of everything toward the place that would measure me in return. The ledger lay heavy across my knees, its leather cold and damp with the night's fog. Dawn had thinned to a gray ribbon along the horizon, but the yard was still mostly shadow. My fingers ghosted over the penciled columns, following figures that never matched the feel of the sacks in my head. The numbers were precise and cruel, the way anything a machine could count would be. They did not know the smell of rot that had lived in my barley, or the grit the harvesters coughed up when the gearbox blew in the third week of reaping. A boot thudded on the threshing plat, the collector's silhouette cut through the mist like a knife. He did not hurry. Tithemen seldom did. Speed was for those who feared being noticed. He had a voice like wind through corrugated metal. Ledger. I closed the book and handed it over. The paper whisper had the same small, hollow sound as the sacks when you lifted them. He flipped the pages with long, economical movements, murmuring the totals. His eyes scanned the margins. Where my father had used blunt strokes and a steady cipher, my own notations were cramped, torn in places, the ink blotched by sweat. The collector's lips tightened when they landed on the last line. Shortfall, he said. It wasn't a question. The word fell between us, heavy as a threshing flail. He tapped the number. The tip of the pen left a small smear on the page, an accusation in indelible ink. I could feel the barn settling around us. Pigeons muttered in the eaves. A low, steady breathing came from the grain store. Hundreds of tons of sleep shifting where the cold air met warm grain. The world smelled of old straw and the faint iron tang of ration oil. For a moment I let myself remember the last full harvest year. Lamps that stayed lit through the night. My sister laughing on the cart as we drove the last load in. The laugh had become a thing I could not call up anymore. Memory had a way of being ornamental here, like a brass sun hung on a wall to soften the light. The tithe did not buy laughter. It measured the sun itself. You underscored again, he said, tapping the ledger. Less than stated receipts. I kept my face blank. There were faces I could not afford to make then. Fear, pleading, anger. Faces were currency you spent at the wrong booth. I said only, the stores are down more than the fields. He looked up at me, and for an instant I saw calculation behind the collector's eyes, a small, sharp geometry of profit and punishment. He could order seed withheld, requisition my draft animals, or take men to work the swamps in place of sons. He could have me listed as default, my name inked across a file that would follow my family like a shadow. "You falsified the ledger last quarter," he said, and the words landed like a stone turning the water. "You presented less crop than declared, then adjusted at the appraisal." My throat closed. I had not meant to remember that night. The appraisal had been a raw thing. Cold benches, the hiss of a steam meter, two clerks in muffled coats who ran their fingers along my numbers and asked nothing of the hands that planted the seed. I had come away with an absence of grain I could not explain away unless I had intended it. "I made a mistake," I said. My voice was small, but it held. Mistake was a word you could still argue with. Sins disappeared if you called them mistakes enough. He laughed, but it was not warm. Mistake after mistake stacks against you like bad weather. The administratum keeps a ledger wider than yours. We cross-check all you like," I interrupted. The words surprised me with their sharpness. I put the ledger down, made a show of straightening the only clean patch on my sleeve. "There are reasons grain never reached the counting hall." "Rats," I told the clerks. "Spoilage. The harvester—" He raised a hand. "Reasons do not change obligation. The tithe is not partial to harvest excuse. The emperor requires the number. The governor requires the numbers lined up. Orders are orders." I could see the edge now. He was not the man who could bend for a family. He was the man made for lists. My eyes dropped to the ledger again. In the margins, between someone else's neat stamps, someone had written a notation in faded violet. "Seed allotment." That was the knife. If I failed, seeds would be stripped to the bones of our fields. Famine would follow like a second winter. There had been one more way, one that smelled of grease and old promises. I thought of the small hollow under the east granary, where the harvesters had once been sheltered from storm. We had used it for things you did not want the clerks to see. Old men had spoken there of barter, of slipping a tithe sack into the dark and swallowing the rest with the earth. I had never yet done it. Doing it would put my children into the story of hiding. It would make cowards where men should stand. "You could make it right," the collector said. "Return what was taken. Make good. Return what was taken." As if grain grew back by apology. As if sacks could be stitched with words and fed to children who had already learned to measure bread by how many fingers they could hide under it. "I don't have it," I said. There was honesty in that it hung like smoke. "Not enough this year." He closed the ledger and set it between us. The book had a smell of old glue and the faint metallic tang of the seals. "Then you will pledge crop for next cycle. You will work the quotas, you will make up the shortfall with your labor." His gaze flicked toward the field where my boy sat on the rusted wagon, hands in his lap. The boy's head was bowed. He had the same stubbornness as a root that grows around stones. The collector's voice softened, just enough to sharpen. "And if you cannot fulfill labor?" he asked. The question was the hinge. There were punishments that fed no one but the ledger. Men could be conscripted, rations removed until skin clung to bone like parchment. Names could be written for debt transport to the works. I imagined my sister's laugh sucked into a thin, sibilant memory as she marched away under a red banner. The picture made bile rise in my throat. I thought of the old contended ledger that had survived 2 generations by being hidden in a hollow beam. My father had once told me that stone numbers could be bent if you bent the truth slowly enough, like a sapling trained by rope. He had not taught me the rope's knots, only the philosophy, survival by willing small lies. He had been a man who could read weather in the smell of the soil. He had not lived to see the tithe men come for the second time. "We can make an arrangement," I said finally. My voice lined up with the decision I had worn like armor for weeks. I would not let my family be parceled out to decrees. If lying would keep the seeds in our barns, then I would learn how to lie cleanly. I had done small dishonest things before, traded a bit of meal for a pair of boots, adjusted a weight here and there for a neighbor. Those were sins that fit my hands. This was wider. "And the ledger?" he asked. "Will you adjust it?" I looked at him. The dawn had turned pale gold. There were already workers crossing to the east fields with their scythes, the first of a long day. The world did not wait on decisions. It measured you by how quickly you moved. "I will adjust it," I said. Saying it felt like stepping out across thin ice. The truth of it sat on my tongue. "I will make the numbers look whole." His eyes narrowed. "Forging the ledger is a grave offense. Forgery invites audits. Audits invite inquiry. Inquiry invites punishment," I finished. The words were flat. He was not wrong, but there are ways. I started. Then I shut my mouth. I had planned this in the dark last week, pulling sacks to the side in the night, scraping away the top of a bundle to find what heat might be hiding. I had done more than plan. I had moved. I had a small sack that smelled of flour and dust beneath the bench where I had sat that winter. It was not much. It was enough to look respectable on a counter. It was not enough to feed my family for long. The collector's hand lay on the ledger like a pledge. "If you attempt such a thing and we discover it, we go to the same ends," I said. I did not tell him the rest, that ends could be more than a ledger line. Ends could be the slow starve of my wife's hands, the loss of letters from the ordos that paid for the med salve, the blank place where my son's name would fit in a roster. He folded the book closed. "Very well. You have until the appraisal to reconcile the receipts. The quota stands." He pushed the ledger back. The action felt like a release and a tightening at once. I took the book and felt its weight. It was heavier now. The signed ink looked like a horizon line between two fields, the part I owned and the part the world demanded. When he left, his boots louder on the path, the yard felt suddenly too wide. I kept the ledger under my arm and walked to the granary. The sun had climbed enough to burn the mist into the air, but the light in the grain room was pale and thick. Dust motes swam like tiny planets in the wide beam of the lantern. I set the ledger down on the nearest barrel and opened it again. I traced the numbers slowly, like a man tasting salt for poison. My hand did not shake as badly as it should have. It steadied with the kind of steadiness only long practice brings, the kind that comes from doing the same hard thing every year until the body forgets to be afraid. There are small arts to making things appear whole. To fill a gap, you need 3 kinds of lies. One to match the texture, one to match the weight, and one to match the smell. The grain must look as if it spent the season where grain should spend it, in the belly of the barn, beneath the careful watch of a husbandman who loves his land. You could not fake the smell unless you knew how to hang the old oils and spices in the sacks. You could not fake the weight without sets of iron weights no one kept in a house like mine. I had one of those small iron weights. It was a remnant of barter, a thing traded for a winter's kindness. It lived in a box with string and nails. It could buy a false balance. It would not buy seeds, but it would buy time. I sealed a small bag with the last of the day's flour. I wrapped it in oilcloth to hide the smell. It was not much. It would be a talisman at best. But talismans could change the course of an audit if placed right. They could tilt a clerk's hand, slow an inspector's suspicion by a breath. I tucked the sack beneath my coat and took the ledger under my arm. Outside, the day had opened up. Men sang in the distance as they cut the first lines of wheat. The sound folded into the pressure in my chest. I walked toward the appraisal hall, not at a run, but at the steady gait of someone who meant to be counted. I had rehearsed the words I would say to the clerks 100 times. I had cultivated a particular kind of grief, a sorrow that smelled like honesty. I had practiced the tilt of the head, the softening of the eyes, the slight cough that admitted fatigue without implying guilt. I had prepared a story of blight and broken machinery and the sincere regret of a man who loved his land. That story was true in part, but the part that could not be told would be locked beneath the coat where the small sack rested against my ribs like a second heart. I had decided to carry a secret to the appraisal, to balance honesty with a deception the size of a handful of grain. It was either that or watch the seeds taken from the ground and my children's hands emptied of work. As I closed the yard gate behind me, the ledger heavy and warm with my palms, I felt the wind move strange across the fields. It sounded like a future being scoured clean. I walked toward the hall where men in quiet coats took your truth and stamped it fit for the world. My feet were steady. Inside me, a plan unfolded its thin wings, fragile and alive. I was going to the appraisal to meet the clerks and the collector, ledger in hand, with a lie folded small and soft against my chest. I did not know if the lie would be enough. I only knew I could not feed in truth what the world demanded in numbers. So I walked into the pale light, and with every step I promised myself to keep my family's name off any list that sought to strip us of seed. The path ahead was a ledger of its own, written in choices. I tightened my grip and moved forward,